In the silence beneath the throne world, he labored alone, crafting a future no soul could yet comprehend. Beneath the Imperial Palace of Terra, deeper than any vault, beyond the reach of mortal eyes or ears, there stood a chamber not recorded in any map or chart. It was not built for ceremony nor for war, but for transcendence. In this hidden abyss, the master of mankind had undertaken his most ambitious creation, a work that would elevate humanity beyond the reach of gods and monsters. It was the Imperial Webway project, and its completion would shatter the chains of the warp forever. In the waning years of the Great Crusade, when stars bowed to the banners of the Imperium and the primarchs scattered the enemies of mankind across the void, the Emperor withdrew from open conquest. He left the wars to his sons, a decision that bred confusion, pride, and ultimately, resentment. Few knew the truth. Fewer still were permitted to see the monumental effort taking shape far beneath the surface of Terra. There, in the deepest dark, the Emperor was building a gate, a door into another dimension, not the corrupted, shifting tides of the warp, but the ancient, alien matrix of the Webway. The Webway had once belonged to the Aldari. It was their great, unseen highway, a network of shimmering tunnels strung across the galaxy, immune to the tides of the immaterium, unreachable by the predators of chaos. Now abandoned and fractured after the fall of their empire, the Webway was vulnerable, and the Emperor meant to claim it. His plan was elegant in concept, staggering in scope. A fully Terran-built portal into the Webway would allow humanity to traverse the stars without fear of the warp's madness or demonic predation. It would make the navigators obsolete. It would banish the gods of chaos to the cold reaches of irrelevance. It would mean true dominion over the galaxy, unchallenged, unassailable. But to do this, the Emperor required power beyond imagining and secrecy beyond understanding. The labor began in silence. Mechanicum adepts from Mars, those few loyal utterly to the Sigillite and the Emperor, were conscripted and brought to Terra. Sworn to secrecy by oaths that bore the Emperor's psychic seal, they entered the depths never to return. They constructed massive energy arrays, labyrinthine conduits, and containment pylons the size of hab blocks. Central to it all was the Golden Throne, a device of both psychic and mechanical genius. It was no mere seat, but a nexus of energy, a master key to unlock and stabilize the Terran Webway gate. Only the Emperor could sit upon it, for its systems required his unimaginable mental discipline to operate, to thread the impossible wires between reality and unreality. The throne was both shield and blade, designed to pierce the veil between dimensions and hold the breach stable. With it, the Emperor could carve a new path through the Webway, an entirely human segment untouched by chaos, forged by will alone. The new tunnels would branch out from Terra, connecting to the remnants of the Eldar's own network. These human-made arteries, lit by the Emperor's psychic light, would one day carry the full might of the Imperium across the stars without ever touching the warp. To achieve this, the Emperor channeled a portion of his vast power into the throne daily, constructing the Webway passage in increments, foot by agonizing foot. Every hour he remained upon it, the construct grew stronger. It was said by the few who witnessed it that the Emperor did not sleep during these sessions. His eyes glowed with purest light, his mind projected into realms no human soul could endure. And always, always, he shaped and warded, crafting psychic bulwarks along the new path, defensive runes layered with will, threads of anti-chaos logic interwoven with psychic force. Every line inscribed with his authority made the tunnel less vulnerable to corruption. The custodian guards stood watch outside the chamber, not as warriors, no enemy could reach so deep, but as symbols of authority, as shields for a secret greater than any weapon. Only a handful of those warriors even understood the purpose of their vigil. Fewer still ever glimpsed the workings within. Once, a custodian commander returned from duty with his eyes wide and voice shaking, speaking of a gate taller than a warlord titan, etched in runes that changed shape as he looked, of rooms that bled light, of machinery that sang in notes only the Emperor could hear. He was relieved of duty and reassigned. No one asked why. The Silent Sisterhood also served below the palace, their null presence a buffer against unforeseen psychic phenomena. The project was surrounded by danger, not just physical or demonic, but conceptual. To gaze upon the raw junction of reality and unreality without protection was to invite madness. The sisters, immune to the warp, were anchors of stability. Their presence was necessary in case something reached back, and something always reaches back. That was the danger the Emperor understood above all. The warp would not tolerate such defiance forever. The ruinous powers, blind and instinctive though they were, would sense the diminishing of their dominion if the Webway were sealed from them. If humanity could travel without prayer, without sacrifice, without madness, what then of chaos? They would strike. That much was certain. The Emperor knew this from the start, but he also believed in the righteousness of his design and the strength of his will to see it done. Every contingency was accounted for, every weakness reinforced. He believed that secrecy would protect the project until it was complete. He believed that his sons, the primarchs, would accept their roles without question. He believed he had time. He was wrong. But in that moment, before the breach, before betrayal, before the fires of damnation spilled into the golden halls, the Emperor was on the verge of triumph. The Webway project was near completion. The Terran gate stood open, if only a crack, stabilized by his unceasing labor. Soon he thought it would be ready. Soon humanity would be free of the warp's chains. Soon he would walk the tunnels of the Webway as their master, not their prey. And so, beneath the palace, the Emperor of mankind sat upon his throne, not as a god, not as a king, but as a father building a future his children might never understand. The last light of the dream burned quietly behind sealed gates, waiting for the first scream to shatter the silence. He only sought to warn his father. What he broke instead was the key to salvation. The Emperor had always known that treachery would find him, but he had not expected the betrayal to come wrapped in love. Far across the void, on the sorcerous world of Prospero, a primarch was weeping. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the Cyclopean Seer, the one the Emperor had trusted above all others to understand the hidden arts, had seen something in the stars, something terrible. The warp had whispered its lies, yes, but buried within those lies, a shard of truth burned like a needle in the soul. Horus had turned. The War Master, first among equals, had opened his heart to the gods of the warp. The heresy had begun. Magnus saw this in fire and blood and screamed into the darkness. What was a son to do? He reached out across the galaxy. He tried every sanctioned channel. No reply. Terra was silent. His father was silent. The Emperor, who had once taught him to walk in the labyrinth of the mind, had turned his gaze elsewhere. In his desperation, Magnus did the unthinkable. He did not knock. He broke the door down. The spell he wove to reach Terra was an act of supreme defiance, a violation of edicts older than the Imperium itself. Gathering the might of every psyker on Prospero, drawing upon his own immense power, an ocean compared to the trickle of lesser minds, Magnus tore open reality itself. The ritual was vast, a great crimson vortex that rose over the towers of Tisca, swirling with raw psychic flame. Even his 1,000 sons, no strangers to forbidden knowledge, flinched at the scope of what he conjured. With one hand, he tore aside the veil of the warp. With the other, he reached into the Emperor's sanctum, and what he found was a miracle and a catastrophe. He saw the throne. He saw the golden gate. He saw the webway, and then it broke. The Emperor's wards, crafted with precision over years, tied to his psychic being, latticed with sigils and logic woven into the very bones of Terra, shattered like glass beneath a hammer. The psychic explosion triggered by Magnus's intrusion did not merely overload the Golden Throne's systems, it ruptured the barrier between real space and the immaterium where it was weakest, within the nascent, human-constructed webway tunnels. There was no scream, no tremor that warned the surface. No one beyond the dungeon even noticed. But below, everything changed. Where there had been light and silence, there was now howling. A rupture opened in the Terran webway gate, not a fracture, but a wound, deep and ragged and hungry. From the bleeding edges of reality, the demons came, not slowly, not cautiously, but as a torrent. The first to die were the mechanicum workers, those unarmed engineers who had been laying the psychic conduit pylons along the new webway branches. They didn't even have time to run. The Neverborn, monsters made of madness, thought, and raw hate, descended in packs. Crimson hounds with bronze teeth, blue flame beasts whose laughter killed the mind, serrated things with a dozen arms and no mouths, whispering blasphemies without tongues. The air turned sour, the light dimmed, walls pulsed like flesh. Chaos had come. The custodian guard stationed nearest the gate, elite warriors without equal, genetically engineered to stand beside gods, were the first to answer. Without hesitation, they activated their guardian spears and charged into the breach. But even their precision and might were barely enough. They held the initial tide back by inches, not miles, their golden armor slick with ichor not meant to exist. The Sisters of Silence followed them. Without words, without fear, they stepped into the webway and made their stand. Where they walked, the warp itself recoiled. The demons hissed in pain at their presence. Reality thickened around them like armor. In silence they held, but they were few, so terribly few, and the wound kept widening. Back on Prospero, Magnus knew. The moment his spell pierced the veil, he felt the backlash. He saw the light shatter. He felt the scream of the webway itself echo through his soul, and in that moment, he understood. He had damned everything. On Terra, the Emperor rose from the throne. The act was immediate. No fanfare, no command, no hesitation. He simply stood, and the Golden Throne shuddered. Those few attending him saw it, blood running from his nostrils, his eyes unfocused, his brow furrowed in pain. The machine howled with alarm. The warp reactors powering the webway gate flickered, sensing the withdrawal of his stabilizing presence. Warning klaxons meant only for apocalyptic failure began to scream. But he did not stop. He raised his hand, and in that moment the psychic signal blasted through the Imperium. Not words, not images, purpose, a summons to war. The Legio Custodes activated in full. Thousands of golden warriors dropped their ceremonial duties and rushed toward the dungeon. The Silent Sisterhood began moving in concert, their ships rerouted from the stars to Terra. Malcador, the Sigillite, appeared as if summoned by fate itself, descending into the Emperor's sanctum to receive his command with grim understanding. The Emperor returned to the throne, but not as before, no longer to expand the webway. Now, he sat to seal the wound. He forced his mind into the churning tides of the warp and began constructing new barriers from thought and will alone. It was not enough to merely push the demons back. He had to unmake the breach itself. He had to recreate the shattered foundations of the webway gate, brick by psychic brick, while demons clawed and bit at the seams. The process was agony. Every moment he remained on the throne now was a war in itself, a duel against the four great powers, each testing his defenses, each probing for weakness. And all the while, the Webway burned. The demons did not wait. As the Emperor poured his consciousness into stabilizing the breach, they pushed further. Beyond the initial gate, they surged into the human-constructed Webway tunnels. These paths had been newly forged, gleaming with psychic shielding, resonating with the Emperor's own warding energies. But now, disrupted and raw, they were vulnerable. Each tunnel became a battlefield. Custodians and sisters rushed into the breach, holding the expanding front inch by inch. Fires lit by flamer units scorched the walls, but flame could only banish, not undo. And demons always return. Worse still, the Terra had exposed ancient weaknesses in the Webway structure itself. The Emperor had been working to stitch Terra's new gate into the old Aeldari pathways. With that integration process violently interrupted, entire sections of ancient Webway architecture began to destabilize. Collapsed tunnels, flickering null zones, psychic storms that surged with the screams of extinct civilizations. And in every corner, demons hunted. What had been a realm of order was now a crucible of madness. Through all of this, the Emperor did not speak, but his thoughts were everywhere. He held the gates. He reinforced the failing bulwarks. He lit paths with psychic flares to guide reinforcements. He protected his sons, even as one of them had doomed him. And still, he did not break. Outside, no one knew. The Imperium marched on. The Great Crusade continued. Horus advanced his rebellion. Guilliman wrote new statutes. Russ prepared for war. But below in the dark, the first true war for Terra had already begun. And the father of mankind fought it alone. He wanted only to warn me, the Emperor would later say, not with anger, but with something far colder, finality. Instead, he doomed us all. He sat upon the machine not as a king upon a seat of power, but as a martyr sealing a tomb with his own flesh. The scream of the breach had barely faded before the warriors of Terra responded. From the lower vaults of the Imperial Palace to the highest spires of the custodians' sanctums, klaxons blared that had never before sounded. Alarms coded not for atmospheric failure or invasion from without, but for a threat from within. A threat that clawed not at the gates of stone, but at the membrane of reality itself. A threat inside the Webway. And in the center of it all sat the Emperor of mankind, fully entwined with the machine that would become his throne. The Golden Throne was not a device of idle majesty, nor a seat meant for rest. It was an instrument of blinding intellect and impossible design, built for one soul and one alone. Its psychic interfaces reached deep into the fabric of unreality, where the Terran Webway gate had been stitched together through sheer will and impossible mathematics. It was both interface and anchor, allowing the Emperor's mind to reach into that alien dimension and shape it. But now it had become a cage. When Magnus the Red fractured the wards, the throne absorbed the backlash. Its many circuits and mechanisms, golden coils, arcane crystals, humming pylons engraved with both human and Xenos script, overloaded in cascading failure. The light within the gate dimmed. The structure groaned as reality bent. The Emperor entered the throne not as a ruler to command, but as a surgeon sealing a hemorrhage with his own body. He merged with the systems, threading his vast psychic essence into every relay. And as he did, something changed. The throne groaned again, not from failure, but integration. Where once it had been an instrument, now it became symbiotic. It was no longer simply a tool through which he worked. It was now a crucible that would hold him, chain him, bleed him. And he accepted it without a word. Around him, the Webway Gate Chamber, one of the most heavily fortified spaces on Terra, was already erupting into combat. The first demonic entities to pour through had been mindless, ravening things, creatures of raw warp impulse, all fang and hate. But as the breach widened, the more complex demons came, greater entities with names of power, hungry intelligences that recognized the prize they now faced. The Gate of Terra, the Imperial Dungeon, the cradle of the throne world, exposed from within. Their howls echoed across the psychic horizon, a note of triumph, of vengeance. The Webway, for the first time in untold millennia, was not a labyrinth of locked doors, but a bleeding artery pointing directly at humanity's heart. And so the defense began. From the Chamber of Watchers, the custodian guard emerged in force. Their auromite plate caught the flickering firelight of the breach as they descended, a storm of gold against a tide of madness. These were no mere warriors. They were the 10,000, chosen from birth, each one a demigod in flesh, forged for the sole purpose of standing beside the Emperor and enacting his will. They did not speak. They did not question. They formed a shield wall at the mouth of the Webway gate and waited. The first clash was not a battle, it was an eruption. A wave of demons surged from the darkness, creatures whose forms defied physics, whose limbs twisted with each moment. The custodians met them with unflinching precision. Guardian spears ignited in arcs of lightning as they were driven through bone that wasn't bone, into flesh that writhed like fire. They fought in silence, save for the thunder of impact, the hiss of melting ichor on armor, the roar of defiance. They fought as the line between reality and nightmare collapsed. Within moments, the breach chamber became a slaughterhouse. Fighting alongside them, their black armor a stark contrast to the golden custodians, came the Sisters of Silence. Silent, soulless, and resolute, they strode into the breach as shadows of death. Their null auras radiated in invisible waves, snuffing out the warp's influence like candles extinguished in a storm. To a demon, their presence was poison. Where the custodians slew with strength and speed, the sisters unmade with absence. No warp entity could endure the proximity of a sister for long. In their presence, demonic incantations failed, psychic flame guttered and died. More than once, a towering beast, half bird, half fire, collapsed into incoherent ash the moment it laid eyes on a squad of sisters advancing silently across the floor. One such sister, Oblivion Knight Neravadras, advanced single-handedly through a mass of shrieking pink horrors. With each step, her null field intensified, reducing the creatures to gibbering sparks. She spoke not a word. She did not scream or pray. Her blade hummed once and then twice, and then the corridor beyond was clear. But it was not a war they could win. Not in the traditional sense, because for every daemon slain, more came. The Golden Throne, even in the Emperor's grip, could not fully reseal the breach. It could only contain it. The demons flowed in through fractures beyond sight, from cracks in psychic space. Every minute gained by the defenders was another moment for the Emperor to strengthen the walls behind them. And so the custodians formed kill teams, hunting squads that ventured down the tunnels themselves, beyond the initial chamber, into the new Webway, human-built paths that had never before known war. There, the light still clung to the walls, clean, geometric, layered with psychic harmonics. The Emperor's signature pulsed in every brick, but now the light was dimming. Demon spore marked the walls. Blood that wasn't blood soaked the halls. Creatures had already begun nesting, breeding, corrupting the psychic code itself. The custodians cleared them in brutal room-by-room purges, reclaiming every inch. Mechanicum engine seers followed in their wake, sealing microfractures, chanting canticles of containment, weaving digital prayers through the machine code. The sisters formed new cordons behind them, bolstering psychic stability with nothing more than their own presence. But the effort drained them. Even nulls have limits, and the Webway, touched as it now was by the raw warp, pushed back. In the midst of all this, the Emperor fought a war no one else could see. Within the machine, his consciousness stretched through the Webway like a spiderweb of golden light. He reinforced crumbling nodes, rerouted energy to failing shields, built psychic bastions against the dark. At times, he did more. He reached out into the minds of those who faltered, gifting strength. A custodian whose will wavered found himself renewed. A sister bleeding from a demon's claw rose, her pain drowned in borrowed determination. It was not control. It was not command. It was a father protecting his children. And always, always, the throne screamed. Not with pain, but with power. It was a beacon now, a flare in the warp that drew every hungry thing for light years. The ruinous powers had sensed the Emperor's defiance, and they were angry. For the first time, perhaps since the fall of the Aldari, the warp had found a gate closed to it, and it meant to tear it open again. More demons came, greater ones, named ones, beasts drawn from the deepest nightmares of ancient Terran myth, beings that had waited aeons for this breach. The defenders did not retreat, even as their numbers dwindled, even as blood stained the wraithbone walls. They stood, they fought, because behind them sat the Emperor, and he did not ask them to die, but they knew in their souls that he would die for them, so they gave everything. And in that place of fire and gold, silence and screams, the first defense of the Webway Gate was carved into legend, not in the records of the Imperium, not in statues or honor rolls, but in the marrow of the universe itself. The day humanity stood against the tide of unreality, and did not break. While traitors howled at the gates, something far worse whispered beneath our feet. Above, the stars burned. The great crusade staggered under the first blows of the heresy. Far across the void, worlds fell into rebellion. The War Master's betrayal festered like a spreading infection, choking the arteries of the Imperium. Word reached Terra slowly in whispers and blood. Primarchs turned against primarchs, legions fought their brothers in the dark. But on Terra there was no civil war, not yet. There was only silence, a silence broken not by rebellion but by something far older, far colder. Beneath the throne world, in the hollow places beneath the Emperor's palace, a war was being fought that no one outside would ever truly understand. The war in the Webway had begun. It was a war unlike any the Imperium had ever faced. No grand banners were raised, no declarations of intent or glorious speeches marked its opening. There was no space fleet to track, no siege lines to draw. The Webway was a realm of thought and light, of paradoxical geometry and impossible distances, and it was compromised. What had once been a secret corridor into hope had become a festering wound, a poisoned artery running straight through the beating heart of mankind's mightiest fortress. Though the Emperor's immediate presence upon the Golden Throne had sealed the worst of the breach, it had not undone the damage. The Golden Throne was no longer an instrument of creation. It was a shield, a fragile dam holding back an infinite sea of madness. The Emperor's consciousness was now irrevocably anchored to the Webway network. He could no longer intervene in matters of the surface world, not lead, not speak, not guide. Malkador the Sigillite understood what that meant before anyone else did. As regent, Malkador bore a responsibility greater than any mortal soul in human history. He alone now moved between the chamber of the Golden Throne and the surface of Terra. It was he who managed the labyrinthine hierarchy of the Imperial Palace, while the Master of Mankind poured every fiber of his essence into shoring up reality beneath them. And Malkador, for all his age and cunning, had seen what lay beneath the world's crust. He had stood in the Webway. He had felt the hunger rising from its depths. He knew that what brewed below could devour not just Terra, but everything. And so a secret war took shape, hidden from the populace, concealed even from many of the Emperor's own commanders. The siege of the Webway would be fought in absolute darkness, its battles echoing unheard beneath the marble floors of the highest spires. Every morning on Terra dawned like the last. Bureaucrats marched through corridors. Administratum officials filed their papers. The legions repositioned themselves for war against Horus. Citizens lit incense and offered prayers to the Emperor's glory. None of them knew that hell had bloomed just beneath their feet. Within the Webway's human-built extension, the first defensive lines had stabilized, barely. The custodians had established staging points, compact redoubts of armor, turrets, and psychic shielding that glowed like fireflies in the dark. Each was named after a dead hero. Post Endymion, Gate Kroll, Vigil Magna. None were further than 2 kilometers from the Terran Gate, and none could afford to fall. Between these outposts, the Imperium fought a slow and agonizing push into the tainted Webway. This was not a war of grand maneuvers. This was hunting. Custodians and Sisters of Silence formed kill squads, moving silently through the glass-like corridors, each one armed for surgical eradication. Their every step was measured, every movement rehearsed. They did not fight for conquest. They fought to cleanse. Each corridor was a trap. Warp-infected zones flickered between reality and unreality. Step too far into one, and your skin might slough off your bones before your mind even understood you had died. Sonic ghosts filled the air with endless murmuring, echoes of words never spoken by human tongues. The walls would pulse when no one touched them. Sometimes the tunnels themselves would simply change. A clean corridor would twist mid-mission, stretching endlessly or shrinking into suffocating claustrophobia. Gravity would invert. Time would skip. It was theater of madness, and the Imperium had no choice but to fight through it. Janicia Kroll, Knight Commander of the Silent Sisterhood, became a ghost in those days. Her sisters, each one soulless, each one invisible to the warp, were deployed at critical junctions where even custodians dared not tread alone. Kroll walked the Webway as if it were her own bloodline, mapping out the flux of corruption by instinct. The Nul Maidens became not merely warriors, but anchors. Wherever a sister stood, the taint of chaos recoiled. It was not hate or prayer that repelled the demons, it was simply their absence. Their very being was anathema to the Neverborn. Without the sisters, the custodians could not have advanced even a single step beyond the gate. But not even the sisters were immune to what the Webway had become. The war changed them. They stopped speaking, not just in ritual, but entirely. Some lost their sense of taste, of time, of warmth. A few simply disappeared. One was found weeks later, embedded in the walls, fused with the crystal lattice of the Webway itself, her face frozen in perfect serenity. Yet they continued. Because if they failed, Terra would fall. No fortress walls, no void shield, no orbital defense would matter if demons emerged inside the core of the palace. It was Malkador who ensured the Webway War remained unseen by the wider Imperium. The Council of Terra was told nothing. Not even the primarchs were informed. It was too great a risk. Trust was a brittle coin, and Horus's treachery had shattered faith between brothers. Even Rogel Dorn, master of the palace's defenses, was kept partially in the dark. His task was to fortify from without. This war was within. Mechanicum engine seers, those not aligned with the traitorous Kelbor Hal, were imported to repair the collapsing segments of the Webway. Their task was impossible. The Webway was not made of metal, not truly. It was psychic architecture, willed into being by intellects far beyond mortal comprehension. The human-built sections, still in their infancy, had no such ancient protections. They cracked and burned at the demon's touch. The tech priests adapted as best they could. They created stabilizer pylons, circuit torques, floating servitor batteries that could project limited psychic resistance. They reprogrammed the walls, added machine code to eldritch runes. Some even tried to converse with the Webway, treating it like a half-living machine. Many of those never returned from the tunnels. Still, inch by inch, the Imperium pushed forward, cleaned corridors, reinforced bulkheads, built fallback points, everything bought with blood. The dead were not recovered. There was no time. When a squad fell in the dark, the passage was sealed behind them. This was the cost of containment. Every inch of advance meant another soul lost, but to retreat even once would be to open a doorway straight into the Emperor's heart. No one would allow that. Even as reinforcements thinned and losses mounted, the defenders pressed on. They began forming rotation teams, each squad entering the Webway for no longer than 88 minutes at a time, the absolute limit before psychic degradation set in. Some refused to come out, others returned weeping without tears. The palace above remained serene. Priests spoke of the Emperor's divine light. Pilgrims wept at the steps of the Sanctum Imperialis. No one heard the battles below. No one heard the screams. And beneath the golden stone, the Emperor remained motionless, his mind locked in a prison of light, holding back a flood no dam could ever truly contain. This was the new normal. A war that would never end. A war fought in silence, in shadow, for a future that now felt as fragile as breath. And no one, not even the Sigillite, dared wonder what would happen when the throne failed, because it was not a question of if, it was only a matter of when. We bled for inches, we died for seconds, and in the dark, where no history would remember us, we held. In the catacombs beneath the Emperor's palace, where light no longer reached and the stars were but myth, time had lost all meaning. The ticking of clocks above, the orbit of Terra's moons, the rhythm of a galaxy falling to war. None of it touched the war beneath the throne. The Webway had become its own world now, its own reality, a place of shadows, screams, and flame. And it had become a tomb, not the kind carved in stone or sealed with gold, but a living tomb of battle, endless, cyclical, and cruel. A place where even memory faded, devoured by the repetition of war. A place where a single misstep meant annihilation, not just of flesh, but of soul. It had been 5 years, 5 Terran years since Magnus's folly tore open the veil, and the first demons clawed their way into the Emperor's dream. 5 years of slaughter. 5 years of holding the line against a foe that could not be starved, could not be reasoned with, and could never be truly killed. The war in the Webway was not a war of conquest or even survival. It was a war of containment. There would be no liberation, no glorious advance, no turning point. There was only the Emperor, bound to the golden throne like Prometheus to his rock, and those few who still fought beneath him, guarding the ragged edges of reality itself. At the start, the Legio Custodes had numbered nearly 10,000. By the 5th year, barely 1 in 10 remained. 9,000 dead. Not slain in duels of honor or on distant battlefields before cheering armies, but in silence, in darkness, often alone. Torn apart by warp-born claws, vaporized by psychic implosions, or consumed by corruption so insidious it left no trace. There were no reinforcements, no replacements. The Custodes were not like the Space Marines. There were no gene seed vaults to draw from, no new batches of golden warriors growing in stasis. Each custodian was hand-forged by the Emperor himself, crafted across decades, perhaps centuries. Each death was a blow to the Imperium's soul. They kept fighting, not because they believed they would win, but because there was no one else. Each of the surviving custodians bore a dozen wounds. Their armor was scored and patched with salvaged ceramite. Their eyes were sunken, their faces hollow with the weight of 5 years without daylight. And still they stood at the gates of a hell that never slept. The Sisters of Silence endured beside them. Their losses were worse. The Sisters had no fortresses to call their own, no legions to draw from. They had always been few. Now they were nearly gone. Entire vigils of the Silent Sisterhood had perished in the first months of the war, giving their lives without fanfare or record. For every sister who died screaming, a dozen more died silently, blades red with demon blood, their null presence suffocating the very reality around them. Some went mad, not in the way of psychers, for they had no minds the warp could twist, but in deeper, stranger ways. The kind of madness that came from being too long in places where time folded and cause unraveled. Sisters who fought in isolation for months returned unable to see light or speak or move except in rhythmic loops. Some simply stopped reacting to the world, eyes fixed on something no one else could perceive. The black ships that once served to harvest psychers now became ferries of the broken. And yet, in that twilight, heroes rose, names that would never be spoken in the Hall of Remembrance, faces that would never appear on a primarch's banner, but in the depths, they were everything. Tribune endymion, once a quiet tactician, became the embodiment of the custodes' last will. His golden armor was pitted and burnt, his blade chipped from constant battle. But his eyes remained calm, even as the world burned around him. He led every counter-push, stood every watch. There were times when he was the only living custodian left in a sector, and still he held. He spoke rarely. When he did, the others listened, not because of rank, but because he had earned their faith in a place where faith died quickly. Then there was Janicia Kroll, Knight Commander of the Sisters of Silence. The soulless queen, they began to call her, not in mockery, but reverence. She never once faltered. Through endless horrors, through battles fought in collapsing tunnels, and across bridges that screamed, she led. Her presence was like a void in the storm, calm, absolute, and terrifying to the Neverborn. They say she once faced a greater demon alone, a creature of change and madness whose every step twisted space. The duel lasted hours, across 1,000 hallways. When it ended, only Kroll stood. Her blade was broken, her armor melted to her skin. She did not speak. She simply nodded and moved to the next fight. But even heroes falter. The Webway did not simply contain demons, it bred new terrors. Entire segments of the tunnels had become twisted echoes of real space, mocking reflections of Terra's cities built from memory and hate. One battalion of custodes entered a replica of the palace itself, complete with golden gates and statues of the emperor. None returned. Another segment reformed itself constantly, looping through terrain from across the galaxy. Frozen tundra, volcanic chasms, low-gravity asteroid fields, all within meters of each other. Fighting there was madness, but fight they did. Then there were the Whispers. They started in the second year. Low, indistinct, never clear. At first, dismissed as background warp static. Then, as more began to hear them, as they took the shapes of long-dead friends, of lovers, of the Emperor himself, they became dangerous. Some warriors wandered into the dark, seeking the voices. None came back. Endymion ordered any soldier who reported hearing voices to be isolated, but he did not punish them. He simply sat with them in silence for as long as he could spare. The Emperor, meanwhile, remained on the throne. His body, what little of it remained, withered by the strain. His mind never left the breach. His presence was the only thing holding the dam shut, a psychic hand jammed into the crack in the world, sealing it with divine agony. At times, those closest to the throne heard his voice, not spoken, felt, not commands. Never commands, but sorrow, regret, and resolve. He knew what this war was costing. He knew what they were enduring. And still, he demanded more, not for power, not for conquest, but because he could not afford to fail. In the 5th year, the demons surged once again, a new wave, stronger than before. Some said the eye of Terra had grown brighter, that Horus had offered sacrifices to fuel the breach. Whatever the truth, the Webway shook. Whole sections collapsed, entire strongholds were lost in minutes. The custodians and sisters fell back, not in retreat, but in preservation. They collapsed corridors behind them, detonated entire sectors. They scorched the tunnels until only ash remained. The war had entered its final stage. There would be no more advances, no more patrols, only survival. The Emperor could not hold forever, and when the dam finally broke, when the throne failed, the flood would come, and humanity would drown, unless someone found a way to seal it first, even if it meant sealing it from the inside. And so, bloodied and burned, the last defenders dug in. 5 years of fire, 5 years of blood. They had not won, but they had not fallen. And in the Webway, in that realm of madness, that was enough. There was a city of silence at the edge of the Emperor's dream, not born of stone or metal, but of memory and time. We called it Calistar, and we died to keep its name from fading. There are places in the Webway that should not exist, not because they are dangerous, most of the Webway is, but because they defy categorization, architecture that predates the birth of stars, corridors that stretch farther inside than their outer boundaries should allow, paths that fold into themselves, looping in non-Euclidean spirals, woven by minds that didn't dream like men. And then there is Calistar. The city wasn't built, it was remembered, pulled from the bones of dead civilizations, patched together with fragments of thought, and set adrift in the Webway like a half-finished sentence in a language no one remembered how to speak. Its wraithbone towers rose like frozen lightning, impossibly tall and thin. Its plazas opened to voids that revealed not sky, but corridors of mirrored dusk. This was where the Emperor's dream came to rest, and it was here, at the heart of the human-built Webway expansion, that the Imperium chose to make its last desperate stand. The name Calistar was assigned by the Mechanicum, a placeholder term, a functional designation for a location too unstable to label. But among the warriors who fought and died in its alleys, it came to mean something more. It meant hope. When the war began to unravel, when the custodians and Sisters of Silence realized they could no longer push forward, Calistar became the anchor. The Imperium needed a position beyond the gate, a bastion to rally around, a place to bleed and not break. And so they fortified the impossible city. The custodians built kill zones among the spires, placing plasma turrets behind semi-transparent buttresses. They embedded force shields into plazas that seemed to rotate in place, anchoring them with auto-reactive pylons driven directly into the wraithbone. Servitor units, reduced now to little more than skeletal machines, were repurposed as static defenders. The Mechanicum set up mobile reactor chambers along the city's spinal roads, powering flickering barrier fields and psychic dampeners keyed to the Sisters' null signatures. Every inch of Calistar was turned into a weapon, but the city itself fought back. The wraithbone of the Eldar is not inert. It remembers. It responds. Some walls would shift without warning, sealing off routes that had been secured hours before. Other structures hummed with latent psychic resonance, reacting violently to the presence of demons. More than once, a sector of the city would sing when chaos approached, a droning, harmonic pulse that echoed through every bone and plate. One custodian, Octor Tyne, reported an entire building collapsing inward the moment a Tzientchian horror set foot upon its steps. imploding with such violence that the demon was crushed into paste before it could raise a claw. The city protected itself when it chose to, but it did not do so out of loyalty. It did so out of memory. Somehow, in its half-conscious architecture, Kalistar remembered the warp, remembered the fall of the Aeldari, and it hated. The defenders learned to work with the city's moods. The sisters, more attuned to psychic flow than the custodians, often served as guides, not through training but instinct. They could feel when the city was calm and when it was not. Kroll herself was said to walk its halls with a natural ease, like she had always belonged there, like Kalistar had been waiting for her. But even with the city's strange semi-sentience aiding them, the defenders were vastly outnumbered. The warp had not been idle. By the time Kalistar was fortified, demons had already seeded themselves throughout its lowest levels. Warbands of the Neverborn had taken root in the understructures, nesting in gravity-sheared vaults and curled walkways that twisted like muscle fiber. The upper towers were choked with warp fog. The skies, not sky at all, but psychic vista rendered into static by the city's geometries, shifted between purple lightning and unending blackness. Then the assaults began. They came in pulses, waves of horror interspersed with long, unsettling lulls. One day, a silence would settle over the city, thicker than dust. Then, without warning, the bells would ring, automated warning systems jury-rigged from dead Mechanicum code, and the enemy would arrive, sometimes in hundreds, sometimes in thousands, sometimes as mindless beasts of the warp, other times led by greater demons or corrupted mortal champions, clothed in madness and fire. The walls held at first. The custodians used their remaining numbers to devastating effect, forming narrow phalanxes that filled the corridors with bolter fire and precise spearwork. Janicia Kroll led flanking strikes with her elite, moving like ghosts, appearing and disappearing with surgical precision. There is a tale, unconfirmed but often whispered, of a battle where a single squad of sisters held a breach for 7 hours while reinforcements regrouped. When the custodians arrived, they found no survivors, only burned corpses and a blood-slicked floor, with one final sister seated against a wall, her helmet off, face serene, sword broken, but still embedded in the neck of a bloated demon prince. These were the kinds of victories won in Kalistar. Not triumphs, not glory, but moments, buying time, buying inches. The Mechanicum tried to reinforce the city's infrastructure, but the Webway itself resisted. Generators would overheat, cables would fuse into walls. One tech priest was consumed by a light bridge that retracted in the middle of a diagnostic ritual, folding her into the fold space between levels. Her screams echoed for 3 days. Still, they fought, and the city endured. But for all their defenses, the demons adapted. The horrors that attacked Kalistar grew more sophisticated. No longer just beasts and claws. Now there were tacticians, creatures that remembered their past lives, sorcerers who once bore Imperial livery. Traitor Astartes began to appear, scattered warbands of word-bearers and Emperor's children who had pierced into the Webway through corrupted portals. These weren't mindless beasts. They knew how to fight. They brought warp banners and heretic siege engines, dragging them across the impossible bridges of Kalistar. Blasphemous sermons echoed through the corridors. Glyphs were carved into the walls to unbind the city's defenses. Psychic storms were summoned to short out the sisters' null fields. And in the midst of it all, the defenders of Terra held their breath, knowing that should Kalistar fall, nothing would hold the demons back from the gate itself. It became a siege in all but name. Rationing was enforced, supplies ran thin, ammunition was salvaged from corpses, water had to be drawn from ancient Eldar reservoirs and purified with extreme care. Some defenders refused rest entirely, taking ampule stimulants to remain on patrol until their hearts gave out. The light in the corridors dimmed. The scent of ozone and rot became normal. The city began to shift faster, less predictably, as if the stress of battle, of violence, was damaging it, as if Kalistar itself was dying, and with it, the last hope of reclaiming the Emperor's dream. Still, the defenders endured, because they had to, because they could not fall back. There was nowhere left to fall to, and though the galaxy above them spun into madness, and the legions prepared for civil war, and Terra itself braced for a siege it could see, none would know that the true war had already been fought, and was still being fought, in silence, in shadow, in Kalistar. We thought we had seen what the warp could offer. We thought the worst was behind us. But the gods were only just beginning to dream. Kalistar had not fallen, not yet. It stood, broken and bleeding, its alien towers fractured under the weight of 5 years of war. The defenders, what few remained, held its gates and walkways with the stubbornness of those who no longer believed in rescue, but refused to abandon the field. Custodians patrolled corridors like wraiths in dented gold. Sisters of Silence, their numbers decimated, were scattered across the upper tiers like living ghosts, nulling the shrieks of warp-born nightmares with their very presence. Every corridor was a memory, every battle a repetition, every victory earned in blood. And then, the screams changed. The warp had noticed. For 5 years, the war in the Webway had been a tide of demons, formless, howling things, birthed in frenzy, driven only by instinct and hatred. They were creatures of rage and hunger, responding to the wound beneath Terra as scavengers do to a bleeding animal. But now they began to move with intent. This was no longer a storm of beasts. This was a war of strategy. The first sign came not in combat, but in atmosphere, where once the air shimmered with static warp resonance, flickers of unreality, and the scent of ozone. Now it grew heavy. The light dimmed in a way that had nothing to do with power loss. The wraithbone walls of Kalistar began to sweat. At first it was dismissed as atmospheric anomaly, but the sisters knew better. They could feel it in the marrow of the city. A pressure, a coming weight, something vast and intelligent pressing against the edges of reality. And then the banners appeared, warp flags of impossible cloth, fluttering in winds that didn't blow, symbols scrawled in languages that could never have existed, sigils that burned themselves into the eye even when unseen. They sprouted like tumors along the outer corridors of the city, left not by demons, but by mortal hands. The traitors had arrived. A host of Chaos Space Marines, long thought lost to the warp's entropy, now marched in lockstep behind their god's will, emerging from corrupted arteries within the Webway. Some were word-bearers, draped in chains and parchment, their flesh twisted by devotion, their weapons singing psalms to the dark pantheon. Others bore the amethyst sheen and baroque distortion of the Emperor's children, moving not with rage, but theatrical grace, killing as if performing a sonata of suffering. But the worst were the World Eaters. No banners, no songs, only chain axes, screaming through flesh and ceramite, driven by the simplest, purest desire to kill. These were not random incursors. They did not stumble into the Webway by chance. They had been summoned, drawn through rifts torn by foul sorcery and faith-fueled blasphemy, guided by the scent of the Emperor's psychic presence. The warp had opened its gates, and through them marched the very architects of humanity's damnation. With them came war machines that should not have fit. Defiled dreadnoughts, bound with demon spirits, crawled through wide arteries, their clawed limbs carving furrows in the wraithbone floor. Warp walkers, mutated shadows of once holy Imperial knights, staggered into battle, their pilots long since absorbed into shrieking, twitching amalgams of flesh and steel. And above them, drifting on tides of unreality, came the greater demons. They were not metaphors, not dreams. They were kings of unreality, each an empire of torment given form. A bloodthirster of corn, horns the size of tank barrels, wings dragging psychic storms in their wake, led the charge into the southeastern halls of Kalistar. His name was not spoken, but felt, like a nail driven into the base of the skull. He cleaved entire corridors apart with a single swing of a hell-forged axe, his roar shattering vox links and shattering minds. From the west came a keeper of secrets, a being of unspeakable grace and lewd horror, whose every movement bent perception and enticed the soul to surrender. It did not attack with brute force, but with lies, illusions, and pleasures so blasphemous that even the null aura of the sisters struggled to erase their echo. To the north, a great unclean one waddled its filth through shattered bridges, spreading a miasma so thick that even custodians collapsed from rot and despair. Its laughter, wet and gurgling, was the sound of 10 billion corpses welcoming their next companion. And through all of this, from the impossible depths of the Webway's corrupted veins, came fire, real fire, warp fire, psychic fire, and something older. For in the center of it all, behind the demon hosts and traitor legions, came a shadow. Not tall, not monstrous, but deep. A presence, something that did not walk but was felt, like a gap in the soul, an absence of meaning where thought unraveled. The sisters could not nullify it, the custodians could not name it. But it came, and with it Kalistar began to die. The first sign was the eastern tower, once a fortified redoubt. It collapsed inward with a sound like weeping, not an explosion, not an attack. It simply gave up. The Wraithbone crumbled as if ashamed of its own hope. Inside, a squad of custodians and 2 sisters were lost. They were the first, not the last. Every day after, the city cracked a little more. Its psychic wards, already flickering, began to fail. Its defenses, never built to endure this magnitude of warp incursion, began to melt. Literally, machines corroded without contact. Lost rifles exploded in their owners' hands. Vox units transmitted static laced with screaming. And yet, the Imperials held. Raw Endymion fought on the bridges like a living myth, his spear a golden arc that drew blood from things that had no veins. When his helmet was shattered by a blow from a traitor dreadnought, he kept fighting. Covered in his own blood, he stood over the body of a slain demon prince for 9 hours, ensuring its soul did not return. Janisha Kroll moved through the city like death incarnate. She no longer slept. She barely ate. She existed in a state of pure focus. It was said that, at the height of the onslaught, she and her sisters walked into a demon horde without orders, without support, and came out the other side hours later, bloody, limping, but alive. The corridor behind them was scorched clean. The sisters, down to fewer than 100, continued to nullify the warp with their lives. When their null fields failed, they fought with knives. When the knives broke, they used their bare hands. There was no hope of reinforcement, no illusions of victory. Only the understanding that Kalistar must hold, because behind Kalistar stood the last functional gateway to the Golden Throne. And if it fell, the demons would not walk through doors or breach walls. They would pour into the Emperor's presence directly. There were plans. Malkador drafted them in the shadows above, contingencies, possibilities. He dispatched agents to search for technologies that might slow the collapse, to find warriors who could enter the Webway and buy time. But none of them arrived yet. And in the impossible city, time had run out. Because this was no longer a battle. This was the beginning of the storm. The onslaught had come, and the gods were no longer merely watching. They were marching. And even in that damned city where hope flickered like a candle in a hurricane, every soul knew the real war had just begun. There are moments in war where the mind shatters before the body, not from fear, but from clarity. When every defense crumbles, when every plan fails, and yet the enemy still comes, you understand? You are going to die, and still, you fight. Kalistar bled, not the poetic bleeding of empires or ideals, but the real physical death throes of a place pushed past its limits. Its wraithbone foundations trembled under the weight of unreality. Its towers leaned not from impact, but from exhaustion. Psychic stabilizers sparked erratically, flickering like dying stars. Machines once blessed by the Omnissiah now groaned with voices not their own. And the defenders, those few still living, no longer spoke of holding the city. Now, they whispered about how to die well. Endymion stood atop the shattered parapets of the silent reach, what had once been a communications tower and was now little more than a pile of scorched bones and shattered equipment, and watched the horizon twist. He no longer wore a helm. It had been cleaved from his head in a duel with a world-eater 4 days prior. The gash still seeped golden blood, staining his collar. He did not care. He stared into the warp-racked distance and saw the impossible. Entire segments of Kalistar had vanished, not collapsed, not overrun, gone. Where the eastern foundations once stretched, there was now only a shimmering wall of shifting symbols and kaleidoscopic storms. No two warriors saw it the same way. Some called it a gate, some called it a maw, some refused to look at it again. Nothing came out of it. Not yet, but everyone knew something would. The demons had stopped assaulting directly. That was the first sign. The endless tide of Neverborn had vanished from the streets. No more waves of bloodletters rushing the barricades. No more beast things clambering through sewer ducts and ancient Eldar tunnels. Now, there was silence. And the defenders feared silence more than war. This was not retreat. This was preparation. The custodians, down to fewer than 200, regrouped at the central district of Kalistar. Their armor, dulled and cracked, bore the scars of thousands of battles. Their faces had lost all softness. They spoke only when needed. Their rituals were gone. Their honor codes now burned in small flames, leaving behind only the instinct to protect, to stand, to be the wall. The Sisters of Silence had fared worse. Perhaps 80 remained, perhaps fewer. Janisha Kroll no longer led from behind. She no longer directed strategy. She had taken the black blade she had once held only for ceremonial rites and turned it upon the warp itself. She walked the front lines now, alone more often than not, her null presence scouring the corruption from the very stones beneath her boots. But she was dying. Everyone knew it. The sisters could feel it. Her field was becoming unstable. The silent aura that had once rippled with controlled force now came in waves, sometimes extending for entire city blocks, sometimes collapsing inward with a violence that cracked stone and left nearby warriors vomiting blood. It was killing her, but no one told her to stop. She was their only weapon left. And still, the Imperium tried to hope, tried to believe that salvation might come from Terra. And so Endymion made the decision. Someone had to reach the surface. The Webway gate could not be opened, not without risking the Emperor's containment of the breach. But a single custodian might thread the way back, slipping past the daemonic net, racing through collapsed tunnels and fading corridors, to warn the sigillite, to beg for aid. He chose Prefect Diocletian Koros, not because he was the fastest or strongest, but because he was the most pragmatic. Diocletian did not believe in fate. He did not pray. He calculated odds and moved with ruthless precision. The kind of man who would waste nothing, not breath, not blood, not hope. Koros didn't argue. He simply nodded. Within 6 hours, he was gone, and with him went Kalistar's last real chance at reinforcement. The rest? They simply prepared to die. There were no sermons, no speeches, but there were resolves, unspoken agreements formed between the dying and the damned. 1. No retreat to the gate. The Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne, fighting an unseen war no mortal could grasp. If Kalistar fell, the demons could not be allowed to reach him. The defenders would die before that happened. 2. No surrender. Not even if limbs failed, not even if madness whispered from the walls. Death would be embraced with clean steel, not corrupted talons. 3. If hope came, it would come too late. The war was no longer about victory. It was about defiance. Meanwhile, on Terra, Diocletian Koros emerged from the Webway gate, alone, burning with residual warp exposure, and barely conscious. The psychic wards flared as he stumbled into the light, dragging torn armor and blood behind him. When they pulled him out, he was half dead. But he spoke, and his words sent ice through the halls of the palace. Kalistar has days, no more. Malkador received him personally. The sigillite did not speak for a long time after Koros finished. Then, slowly, deliberately, he opened sealed tomes that had not been touched since the founding of the Imperium. The unspoken sanction was enacted. A secret order, a contingency so dire, so blasphemous, it had never been spoken aloud in the presence of a primarch. Only the Sisters of Silence had ever known of its possibility. Only Malkador, its consequences. The order was simple. Gather the psychers, not trained ones, not soldiers, not sanctioned astropaths, but the condemned. Across Terra, the black ships began arriving. Within hours, thousands of unsanctioned psychers were being collected, some dragged from prison cells, others from execution queues, some from nowhere at all. Witches, mutants, rogue telepaths. They were not told why, but the Sisters of Silence knew. They began preparing the psych crypts, those terrible black chambers beneath the Imperial dungeon, where the Emperor's wrath would soon be kindled anew. 1,000 souls, 1,000 minds, to be burned in sequence. Their deaths would empower the Golden Throne. Just long enough. Just enough to allow the Emperor to rise. For the first time in 5 years, he would leave the throne, not to rebuild the Webway, but to end the war. To seal the gate, but the cost would be unspeakable. On Kalistar, the defenders knew none of this. All they knew was that the sky had changed, that the city moaned now as if aware of its impending death, that the walls no longer held shape, and the corridors whispered names that hadn't been spoken in millennia. And yet, they stood. Raw Endymion stood at the top of the last intact tower, his spear resting across his shoulders. Janisha Kroll sat in silence in the central plaza, her sisters meditating in a circle around her, each ready to give their last breath. There was no chance of survival. But survival was never the goal. Their goal had always been simple: hold the gate, until the end, until the last breath, until the Emperor himself decided it was time. And somewhere, deep in the humming machinery of the Golden Throne, a flicker of light surged brighter, a breath drawn, a will focused. The war was not over, not yet. Reinforcements do not always arrive as saviors. Sometimes they are merely the last ones left to die with you. When Prefect Diocletian Koros collapsed into the light of the dungeon, his broken voice had shattered more than the silence. He shattered the illusion of time. There would be no long debates, no slow stratagems. The hourglass that had once measured the Webway War in centuries of planning now dropped its final grains in blood. Malkador the Sigillite knew this. He read the emptiness behind Koros's eyes as clearly as the words from his lips. Kalastar had days, maybe, and the Emperor, locked in golden agony, could not be moved yet. So the Sigillite acted. He reached into the darkest corners of Terra, where failures, outcasts, and forgotten oaths gathered dust. There were no reserves left to call, no unblooded legions waiting in orbit. Terra had been scoured for war. What remained was unorthodox. In a chamber lit by candlelight and desperation, Malkador assembled what he could. First came the Knights of House Viridian. Once noble, once proud, they had stood with Mars in the earliest days of the rebellion. They had believed the Fabricator General's lies and lent their war machines to traitor hands. But when the truth of Horus's betrayal emerged, a handful had recanted. Too late. They were stripped of titles, disarmed, and bound in dishonor. But they were not executed. Not yet. Now, with Kalastar teetering, they were given a chance to atone. They were offered their war gear, cracked, outdated, half-ruined from years of disuse. They did not hesitate. 5 knights. That was all. But to the defenders of Kalastar, they would seem like titans. Then came the Archimandrite. She was not a single being, but a gestalt intelligence enshrined within a form of towering adamantium and surgical cruelty. A Magos of the Ordo Reductor, exiled for doctrines too brutal even for the Mechanicum, she had been sequestered beneath Terra since the Treaty of Mars had begun to fray. She answered Malkador's summons not with words, but with algorithms transmitted as bursts of logic, script too complex for human comprehension. She came not for loyalty, not for redemption. She came for knowledge. The Webway was a vault of secrets, and she meant to see them all. Then came the Cripple, Astartes, Blood Angel, Dominion Zephin. Once he had walked as a demigod among the stars, a captain of fire and poetry. Then Istvan V had burned, and with it most of his body. His legs, his arms, his lungs, lost. What remained had been rebuilt, piece by agonizing piece, until he stood once more. Not whole, but capable. He had been left behind on Terra, not out of cruelty, but out of futility. A relic too broken to command, too proud to die in bed. He took the news of Kalastar's fall without question. When Malkador asked him to fight, he simply replied, "I am already dead. Let me choose where my soul rests." With these few came others, minor tech priests loyal to the Sigillite, clusters of Skitari, mind-locked servitors, a handful of half-trained solar auxilia officers, all cobbled together into a force more symbol than solution. A broken sword, reforged in desperation. They entered the Webway through a back channel, an auxiliary conduit sealed by the Emperor himself years before. The cost to reopen it had been steep. Several psychers died just activating the threshold. And then they stepped into Kalastar. It was no longer a city. It was a wound. The streets writhed. The light had become an ambient moan. Corpses floated midair where gravity had forgotten its duties. Wraithbone towers had curled inward like dying flowers. The sky above, once a frozen sheen of unreal stars, now pulsed red with hate. The defenders were shadows. Barely 200 custodians, their armor cracked, weapons fused with gore. Perhaps 70 sisters, pale and silent, faces half-masked in dried blood. No engineers, no medics, only warriors. They watched the reinforcements arrive without ceremony, no cheers, no relief. Just a brief pause, a glance and the understanding. You are here to die with us. The Knights of Viridion strode forward, their reactors lighting the broken plazas. The custodians made way. They did not offer thanks, but they offered space. And in the Webway, that was a gift beyond measure. The Archimandrite surveyed the city with unblinking sensors. She marked failing stabilizers and deployed Skitarii to shore up key nodes. She sealed off 3 corridors with gravitic mines and activated drone forges to monitor warp resonance. Her presence brought structure but no comfort. She did not speak, but her machines worked. Dominion Zephon found the sisters first. He walked with uneven steps, his augmetic limbs grinding, each movement an act of defiance against his own ruin. He bowed to Janisha Kroll without words, and she nodded once. Later, he would lead a flanking maneuver against a corrupted tunnel host and personally slay a word-bearer with his broken power sword. Kalistar breathed again. Not much, but enough. And then the warp struck back. The onslaught returned not as a wave, but as a maelstrom. Demons poured through the broken Eastern District, more than ever before. Greater demons. Blight cysts ruptured from the sky, spilling plague-bearers in glistening heaps. Slanesh-born shrieked through the outer gates in whirling pirouettes of blades and sinew. Warp lightning cracked the plaza spires, and the air ignited with pure hate. The last stand began in earnest. The Knights of Viridian charged. One fell within the hour, dragged down by a living tower of bone. Another sacrificed itself to plug a collapsing causeway, detonating its own plasma core to vaporize a horde of nurglings that had breached the flank. The Archimandrite stood at the center of it all, limbs aflame, broadcasting untranslatable war chants to her machines. When a demon engine breached the western wall, she crushed it beneath her mass-driven limbs and flayed it open with a cry that sounded suspiciously like joy. Dominion Zephyr led a strike through a collapsing wraith temple, cutting down demonettes with precision that belied his bionic frame. One arm was sheared off by warp rot. He kept fighting. Janisha Kroll vanished for a full day. When she returned, she was carrying a demon's severed head. She dropped it at Ray Endymion's feet. He did not ask. The last stand was not a singular event. It was 1,000 moments, a final mosaic of courage, madness, and inevitability. By the end of the second day, Kalistar had shrunk. Only the central plaza, the gate-ward corridor, and the southern approach remained. The rest had been lost, sealed, collapsed, or consumed. The defenders knew the end had come, but they did not retreat. Because behind them, the Golden Throne still burned. And somewhere the Emperor was preparing to rise. And so they fought, not for victory, but for time. And as the last sunless cycle bled into darkness, the banners of the Imperium were planted into ash and bone. They would not be pulled down. Not without breaking every enemy first, not without fire, not without blood, not without one last stand. It was not the demons that brought ruin to Kalistar. It was not fire or war. It was certainty, the cold betrayal that always follows when pride whispers louder than duty. For 2 days and nights, though time meant little in the Webway, the defenders of Kalistar held against the onslaught. Held not with hope, but with purpose, with grim, clenched bone acceptance. They knew the end was near. They could feel it in the way the walls warped, in the flicker of their own shadows. But they fought on, and because of them, Terra endured another day. It should have been a final triumph of defiance. Instead, it became a grave born of treachery. The Archimandrite had arrived as salvation. Her towering frame, a walking fortress of ancient mechanicum might, brought order to the chaos. She was a force of logic, of brutal clarity, assigning units and rerouting power as though she had always belonged in the city's strange design. Her constructs repaired collapsed wards. Her Skitarii squads established overlapping kill zones. Her drone forges spat out monitoring relays by the dozen. Her actions saved lives. But the Archimandrite did not fight for Terra. She fought for understanding, for access. From the first moment she stepped into Calistar, she was calculating. Not the odds of victory, but the metrics of opportunity. To her, the dying city was a vault of fractured knowledge. Its collapsing matrices and tortured warp resonance held data no mechanicum priest could ever replicate. Even in the midst of carnage, she was scanning, storing, learning. The whispers of the Webway were not horrors to her. They were riddles, and riddles demanded answers. In the 29th hour of the renewed assault, with the defenders at their thinnest and the warp bleeding through every surface, the Archimandrite withdrew. Silently, systematically, treasonously. It began with a signal pulse, a code hidden inside an innocuous servitor broadcast, undetectable to human ears, but unmistakable to the machines under her command. As one, her forces pulled back. Skitarii squads rerouted themselves down maintenance tunnels. Defense drones went dormant. Grav mines disengaged their tethers. Relay points flickered out one by one. And then came the knights. 3 of the remaining knights of House Viridian turned and followed the Archimandrite's path without a word. Only one, the Knight Resolute, hesitated. Its pilot, a young noble named Alistair Var, stared into the heart of Calistar's ruin and saw the flames still burning. He heard the Vox crackling with calls for support. He turned his knight around and was struck down by Justicar Glorian, the leading Viridian knight, in a single traitorous blow. Var's cockpit imploded, his reactor overloaded, sending molten shrapnel into the Wraithbone walls. The others did not stop. They followed the Archimandrite into a side path, an ancient forgotten artery of the Webway, one that led not back to Terra, but toward Mars. That was her true aim. To bypass the Emperor's Gate, to find the unguarded segments of the Webway that still connected to the lost tunnels beneath the Red Planet, to seize them, to own them. She did not warn the defenders. She did not believe in their survival. Calistar, to her, was already dead. Her retreat tore open the lines. Entire defensive positions were left exposed. Sectors that had depended on Skitarii fire discipline now stood unguarded. Null-dampening pylons were left without power. The shields the knights had reinforced flickered and died. And the demons knew. Oh, they knew. They surged through the gap like wolves through a broken fence, not blindly, not with mindless aggression, but with intent. They had waited for this moment, for weakness, for betrayal. Now it was time. The first to fall was the southern approach. What had been a bulwark for 5 years collapsed in minutes. Flesh beasts poured through the gaps, shrieking praise to their gods. Word-bearers followed, chanting liturgies in voices that should not have carried. Blood flowed in sheets. Ra Endymion was there. He watched it happen, watched the lines falter, the custodians swallowed in screams. He ordered no retreat. He did not rage. He did not curse the Archimandrite. He simply raised his spear and charged. For 3 full hours, he held the Bridge of Teeth, a narrow span of wraithbone suspended above a chasm of roiling unreality, alone at times, with only a handful of sisters beside him at others. Janisha Kroll fought at his side briefly until she was pulled away to stem a new breach. But Ra did not fall. Not then. Elsewhere, Dominion Zephon rallied a cluster of surviving Skitarii and formed a flanking assault on the western tunnels. His movements were slower now, his augmetics damaged, one eye gone, but he moved with purpose. He fought with fury. His blade, once elegant, now shattered and fused to his wrist, became a cudgel of vengeance. In the plaza, Kroll returned, and she saw the end. The plaza was collapsing. A greater demon, some fusion of Nurgle's corpulence and Slaanesh's perfection, strode through the wreckage, its laughter splitting stone. Sisters died around her, torn apart by claws that moved faster than thought. Janisha stood her ground. She activated her null field to its full, unstable limit. The resulting blast vaporized the demon in a surge of anti-psyker energy, so violent it left a crater in the plaza's floor. But it also took a toll. Janisha Kroll fell to her knees, bleeding from the eyes, her aura sputtering. Still, she did not break. Kalistar was falling, but she would not give the enemy the satisfaction of her collapse. In the gate-walled corridor, the final retreat began. Ra Endymion arrived last, bloodied. His spear cracked, armor blackened by warp fire. He looked back only once. The impossible city was gone, collapsed into ash and madness, its towers devoured by unreality, its paths folded into nightmares. The last of its defenders fled through a narrowing passage of sanity, guided by failing lights and the will of gods. They reached the edge, the final bastion, the Webway gate of Terra. Beyond it, the golden throne. Behind it, hell. And as the corridor collapsed, sealing behind them in a final act of mercy, the defenders turned and faced their last task: to guard the gate, to wait for him, and to hold, no matter what came through next, because Kalistar was dead. But Terra still lived, and the Emperor was coming. The gate would close, but not without a price, and so he gave one final order, not to a warrior, but to a man. The light of the Emperor burned hot, too hot. Even the most battle-hardened custodians, forged in silence and flame, could not bear to look directly at him now. Not as he was in those final hours, enthroned, motionless, yet pouring his will into the bones of Terra itself. The war in the Webway had reached its crescendo. Every inch of the labyrinth writhed with unreality. Kalistar had fallen. The last surviving warriors had pulled back to the core gate, battered and bleeding, their lives reduced to one final task: hold, until the Emperor could finish it. But something had gone wrong, horribly wrong. A demon, not one of the mindless warp spawn, but a powerful and cunning predator, had forced its way through the shrieking lattice of the Webway. It did not emerge with claws or fire, but with purpose. A creature of shadow and psychic venom, it sought not to destroy the Emperor, but to bind itself to a custodian, to claw into the reality his presence was stitching together and hitch a ride back to Terra. And it found its vessel, Tribune Ra Endymion. The daemon latched onto him, not physically but psychically. Like a parasite, it fed on proximity to the Emperor's light, latching deeper into Endymion's soul with every moment. He felt it burrowing, folding into his spirit, an impossible weight threatening to drag the corruption back through the very gate the Emperor was about to seal. It could not be allowed. If the demon remained tethered to the heart of the dungeon, it would reinfect the Webway from within. Seal or no seal, the breach would eventually reopen, and all would be undone. The Emperor knew this, and so, as the golden light of the throne reached its apex, he spoke. One word, not through vox, not through intermediaries, not even through language, but directly into Ra Endymion's soul, a command as final as death. Run! Ra staggered. Blood leaked from his nose, ears, and eyes. He tried to speak, to protest, to understand. But the voice came again. Run! Never stop! It was not a command of cruelty. It was an act of mercy. The demon had latched on to Ra's essence. Wherever he went, it would follow, like a spear flung into the void, trailing corruption behind it. So long as Ra moved deeper into the Webway, deeper into the half-collapsed alien tunnels the Emperor could no longer control, the creature would follow. And once the gate was closed behind him, the demon would be trapped forever. So Ra obeyed, not because he wanted to, but because he understood. He turned without another word, armor cracked and caked in demon ichor, and sprinted into the flickering dark of the Webway. Every step echoed through impossible geometry. Every breath was a prayer not for salvation, but for speed. Behind him, the light began to collapse. The Emperor, at the center of the dungeon, exhaled one final searing pulse of psychic power. The throne screamed as it drank his soul deeper into its machine structure. Warp portals shuddered and fell in on themselves. Webway corridors folded like parchment. The wound Magnus had torn, one that could have consumed Terra, sealed with a thunderclap of will, and raw endymion was gone, swallowed by an endless storm of passageways, running ever deeper into an unmapped infinity. A golden ghost pursued by a demon of nightmares. The gate closed, not with ceremony, not with celebration, but with finality. The custodians who survived the war never saw Ra again. His name was never recorded in Imperial archives as lost. There was no tomb, no remembrance. Only those who were present, Malcador, the sisters, the Emperor himself, knew what had happened. That Ra Endymion had become a living lock, a soul carrying corruption into exile, a sacrifice too absolute to be honored. And yet they say that in the forgotten corners of the galaxy, deep within the veins of the Webway, there are whispers, rumors, tunnels where time does not flow, and a golden blur is seen racing endlessly down infinite halls, pursued always by a shadow that can never quite catch him. The last custodian, the cursed exile, still running, still obeying, because the Emperor told him to, and that was enough. There are wars that are remembered in song, there are heroes carved in marble, and then there is the one who ran, not to escape, but so the rest of us could stop running. The gate closed. The scream of reality folding in on itself rang out like the dying breath of a god. The Webway breach collapsed in a psychic implosion, so absolute it stunned even the Neverborn. Wraithbone twisted, melted, and reformed. Tunnels shimmered in a blur of time dilation and impossible geometry before vanishing entirely. A million strands of impossible corridors became one sealed thread, cut off, locked away from Terra forever. The Emperor exhaled once and was still. The golden throne groaned beneath his weight, its vast machinery now permanently fused with his mind, feeding his soul into the stabilizers that held the Webway shut. The throne was no longer a conduit for a vision of freedom. It was a prison of purpose, but he had done it. The war in the Webway was over. Yet, something still ran. Far beyond the light of Terra, deeper than any map of the ancient Eldar matrix had ever reached, there was movement. A golden streak through unreality. A custodian, radiant and shrouded in purpose, sprinting down corridors that no longer had meaning. Hallways that stretched for eternity, folding into themselves like the pages of a closed book. Ra Endymion had obeyed. He ran. He had not looked back. There had been no time, no farewell, only the Emperor's voice echoing through his soul like a brand. Run, never stop. A demon pursued him. It was not a thing of snarling jaws and fire. It did not scream. It hunted. It had no name in mortal tongue, no form that could be remembered. It had once been a lord of the warp, a being of cunning and depth, one who had slipped into the Webway not to destroy, but to infiltrate, to infect, to taint the Emperor's golden works from within. But it had overreached. It had touched Ra Endymion, and in doing so had bound itself. The Emperor had sensed it instantly, a tether, a bridge, a trap, and so he had turned the trap against it. Ra had become the bait, the lure, the lock, and now the demon was his shadow. It could not break free from him, not while he moved, not while he stayed in motion, its link strained by the rolling paradox of Eldar geometry and sheer psychic distance. So Ra ran. He no longer knew where he was. The Webway had become a blur of alien light, splinters of bone vaults and dust-choked arcs flashing past like dream fragments. Gravity changed, time flexed, Some tunnels expanded endlessly before collapsing into pinpricks of impossible density. He should have died, but he didn't, because the Emperor had willed him not to. Ra was no longer just a custodian. He was a living extension of the Emperor's decree, a sentinel cast into exile, burdened with the weight of a demon that could never be allowed to return. He did not sleep. He could not stop. Sometimes he passed remnants, ruined sections of the Eldar Empire, echoing with psychic decay. Once he glimpsed an entire craft world, hollowed out and adrift, a silent city entombed in the Webway's rotted bones. It did not see him. He did not pause. The demon always followed. Sometimes it whispered. It had learned to speak in Ra's own voice, asking for mercy, for reason, for understanding. It begged, taunted, laughed. It conjured illusions, visions of Terra burning, of the Emperor's voice calling him back, of the other custodians condemning him as a coward. But Ra knew better. He had heard the Emperor's true voice. He had felt the raw, soul-burning weight of that final command, not as an order, but as a gift. The Emperor had not demanded his sacrifice. He had entrusted him with it. And so Ra carried it forward. Each step a defiance, each breath a continuation of that most sacred of decrees. Humanity must live, even if he could not. Back on Terra, no one spoke of him. The war in the Webway was buried, sealed in silence, classified, erased. The remaining Sisters of Silence left the vaults, their numbers devastated, their souls marked. The custodians who had fought beside Ra never uttered his name aloud again. But they remembered. They knew. And in the gate ward hall beneath the Imperial Palace, a single spear was placed against the wall. Its haft was cracked, its edge dull. No plaque marked it, but every 10,000 who passed that way touched it. Briefly, silently, like a prayer. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. Ra kept running. He saw stars die through collapsed passages. He passed battles between forgotten races, echoing in fractured time. At times, the Webway screamed with the voices of gods, echoes of the fall, of things far older than humanity. He ran through fields of psychic static, where thought itself tried to freeze him. The demon remained behind him, always just out of reach, always hungering, always trapped. And still he ran. His armor became worn, burned, reformed by the psychic friction of the passage. His face aged but did not decay. His heart beat slower, but it beat still, because the Emperor had told him to. In the years to come, during the siege of Terra, Horus would stand before the gates of the Imperial Palace. Worlds would burn, legions would shatter. The Emperor would rise again, for the final time, to face his most beloved traitor. But even as he walked the corridors of the vengeful spirit, even as lightning and fire shook the stars, he remembered. One man, one spear, one voice that had obeyed. Some say Ra Endymion still runs today, 10,000 years later, deeper in the Webway than thought or time can follow. A blur of golden light through the endless dark, carrying a demon behind him like a coffin on a leash, carrying the Imperium forward, one step at a time. He is not forgotten, not by the Emperor, not by the gate, not by those who still listen to the silence beneath the throne. The fire is gone, the gate is shut, the silence remains. But if you listen closely, the silence tells you everything. There is no monument to the war in the Webway, no statue in the Imperial Palace, no entry in the codices of remembrance, no ballad sung by the ecclesiarchy choirs, nor picked capture hanging in the Hall of Heroes. And yet, deep beneath the throne world, in the buried places where the light of Terra never reaches, there lies a silence that speaks more clearly than any stone. The war happened. The ashes are still there. They were never swept clean. They could not be. for the lowest vaults of the Imperial dungeon still echo with psychic scars. The Wraithbone architecture, once luminous and smooth, bears stress fractures no artificer can repair. The custodians know not to tread too far into certain corridors. Even the Sisters of Silence, long gone from Terra's surface, warned that these tunnels no longer obey time as the surface does. In one sealed hall, there is a floor, blackened and concave, rippled like liquid metal scorched mid-wave. Here, Janisha Kroll activated the null field that killed the demon prince and herself in the same breath. In another vault, scorched walls hold the shadows of Skitarii, who burned when containment pylons detonated. A single scorched power lance was recovered from the wreckage, its haft still gripped by skeletal fingers fused into the alloy. It was left exactly where it was found. No one dared to move it. And in the gate ward chamber, the last entry to what had once been the Terran Webway gate, a single custodian spear rests against the far wall. Raw endymions. It is cracked, worn, still stained with warp blood, though it has not dripped in centuries. It is not enshrined. It is left, a silent symbol for those who remember the price of keeping the gate closed. Above the ashes, the Imperium prepares for war. Horus comes. His fleet gathers in the void like vultures circling a dying god. Across the walls of the inner palace, Lord Dorn strengthens defenses and recites tactical permutations. Gun batteries are reloaded, shield harmonics recalibrated, Psychena wards relayed in triplicate. But the greatest fortress of all is beneath them. The Emperor no longer walks. His spirit, so vast it once filled the palace like a sunrise, has contracted, focused, bound within the immensity of the Golden Throne. He no longer guides fleets, no longer speaks in the minds of his sons. He guards the gate. Even with the Webway breach sealed, the danger lingers. The ruinous powers do not forget wounds so easily. Though Ra Endymion runs forever with their parasite bound to him, the demons claw endlessly at the sealed paths, probing the throne's containment like rats gnawing at the door of a locked tomb. If he shifts his attention even for a moment, they will find a crack. And if they find a crack, everything ends. And so, he gives everything. Not just thought, not just will, but being. Every heartbeat of the Emperor now pulses through the throne like a fuel line on the edge of overload. The Psyker engine deep beneath the Mechanicum Sanctum burns with constant sacrifice. The black ships bring their condemned by the thousands, souls who will never know why they die. Their deaths are not acts of cruelty, they are insulation. Batteries for a god who can no longer stand. And even as Malkador oversees the final fortifications of Terra, even as the High Lords bicker over contingencies, only a few understand the cost of what the Emperor has become. The custodians who fought in the Webway, those who survived, do not speak of it. Not out of shame, but reverence. Their golden armor remains dented and charred. None have replaced it. It is worn in memory of those who never returned from the impossible city. In training halls, the new initiates sometimes ask why a certain corridor is always avoided, why the lowest vaults of the dungeon are not on their schematics. Their instructors never answer. They simply gesture to the spear, touch it, and move on. The mystery is its own protection. One day, perhaps, they will understand. Ra Endymion's name is never spoken on Terra again, but he is not forgotten. The Emperor remembers. Even bound to the throne, his mind fractured across 1,000 functions, he holds Ra in his sight. He does not summon him, does not call him back. He watches, always, as the loyal custodian continues his unending run through the haunted arteries of the Webway. Some say they've seen him. Explorators from the Ordo Xenos or Eldari outcasts skimming the shattered tunnels of the Lost Realms report a golden blur. Always just out of reach, always pursued by something vast and shapeless. They do not understand what they've seen. They do not need to. The Imperium does not record these sightings, because the Imperium has long since buried that war, and yet, in hidden places, the ashes remain. In one of the sealed halls beneath the throne, there is a mirror, the size of a doorway, set into the wall by hands long dead. It does not reflect. It shows only darkness, a flicker of movement and faint echoes of something running. It is never touched, not even by Malcador. Only the Emperor knows what he sees in it. And sometimes, it is said, the light in the hall pulses softly, like a heart. So many think of the Emperor as a warrior, as a conqueror, as a god. But beneath the palace, beneath the stone and steel and flame, the truth of his greatness remains carved in silence. He gave up everything, not to rule, not to dominate, but to hold a single door shut, so that we could live, so that we could war amongst ourselves, rage across the stars, and fail in his name. And still, he holds it, and he remembers. He remembers the flames of Calistar. He remembers the scream of Wraithbone breaking. He remembers the spear raised in defiance. He remembers the one who ran. And beneath the throne, the ashes still whisper. They say, "We held." He watched. And one of us still runs.